The three speakers speaking tonight, we have first Jackie Davis, a journalist, broadcaster and editor, Dr. Garvan Walsh, a Brussels-based political strategist, think tanker and pro-democracy activist, and Dr. Stephanie Luke, a research associate based in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. So the aim of today's discussion is to offer an understanding of the potential impacts of the EU elections and an analysis of what they could mean for the next stage of the UK-EU relationship. We will hear first from Jackie, who we have asked to set out for us the broader context around the election. Then we will pass to Garvan to speak second on the potential threat of the far right, and then from Stephanie, who will speak briefly on the EU's Green Deal and how divisive it can be. Now, Jackie, the floor is yours. Please tell us exactly why these elections are so important and what they might mean for the UK.
Thank you very much indeed, and good evening, everybody. It's a delight to join you. I'm going to try and give you just a very brief snapshot of, as you say, why the elections matter so much and what impact they could have on the EU over the next 5 years. First thing to say is this is a remarkable exercise in transnational democracy. More than 400 million people potentially going to the polls between June the 6th and 9th to vote for 720 MEPs to fill the European Parliament. And the Brussels bubble, as we often call those of us who live and work here on a daily basis, is filled with trepidation about what the results might mean for the EU as a whole and also for the member states' national governments, amid widespread predictions of a surge in support for the far right, for populists and anti-EU parties, and against the backdrop of rising political tensions. European elections are always important because the European Parliament, as I'm sure you all know, has significant powers to shape and approve new EU laws jointly with national governments. It plays a key role in upholding EU values, with the rule of law in particular now under threat in some member states as never before in the history of the EU, has a key role in terms of approving the EU budget and how money is spent. And we'll come back to this in appointing the European Commission and holding it to account. But this time, it's more important than ever. It's seen as potentially the most consequential elections since the first direct elections to the Parliament in 1979. And it's not putting it too strongly, I don't think, to say there is a sense in some countries that democracy itself is on the ballot paper. In the EU's case, it could determine whether the EU is able to function effectively over the next 5 years in the face of the myriad challenges we face, and if it's able to shape its long-term future. It also could determine the fate of some of the EU's flagship policies from this 5-year term. For example, the European Green Deal, but I know Stephanie is going to say more about that later. But the crucial question, which I think everyone is going to try and address tonight, is, are the predictions that there could be a political earthquake here in Brussels justified? First to say, in terms of the makeup and the impact of fragmentation, it is clear mainstream parties are losing out to more extreme and to smaller parties, and we will see a much more fragmented political landscape. There are predictions that up to a quarter of MEPs could come from far-right anti-EU populist parties. However, the polls that are being conducted suggest that the three mainstream centrist party, the centre-right European People's Party, the centre-left Socialists and Democrats, and the centrist Liberals Renew Europe, will continue between them to still have a reasonably comfortable absolute majority of around 400 seats. The predictions vary a little depending on the pollster. There is also a possibility for the first time that all the parties of the right would be able to form a majority. But I think it's very unlikely that the centre-right would get into bed with those on the far right, on the extremes, because of what's known in Europe as a cordon sanitaire, where they tend to isolate and not bring them into government where they can avoid it. So the question, which we'll try and help answer this evening, is does this mean that the wheels of EU decision making will grind to halt in a much more disruptive parliament? I think it will be more disruptive, but it probably won't lead to paralysis, because there is the prediction that what sometimes is called the super coalition, the super grand coalition of mainstream parties, very much a tradition in Europe of mainstream parties working together. We don't have so much adversarial politics as in the UK, will hold, and that populists will find it hard to get their act together. But I know Stephanie is going to come back on that, I think, later on. But it could make it impossible to get agreement on reforms that are needed to enable the EU to function effectively as it contemplates, with Ukraine becoming a candidate for membership and other countries, as it complicates getting bigger than ever before and facing bigger challenges than ever before. So even if the day-to-day business is not affected, the long-term future of the EU could be. Just to mention briefly, turnout could be absolutely crucial. It rose to just over 50% last time, having fallen every time since direct elections were first introduced. Paradoxical, given that the European Parliament's powers had increased exponentially. But abstaining from voting is likely to make it easier for the populists to succeed, because their voters are more likely to turn out. So turnout will be a crucial factor, but don't read too much into it. Sometimes people say, oh, this shows people don't care about the EU. I'm always a little sort of pour cold water on that, in the sense that national turnouts are not all that great. And also, most campaigns in most EU countries tend to focus on national issues. They are not really debates about the EU. They are debates about national issues. People use it to give a government a kicking, or if a government is very popular, not so common, to support that government. So it would be very unwise to read the results as some sort of referendum on the EU, I think, although some will try to insist afterwards, if it suits them, that is what has happened. The key decisions the new parliament will take, one thing to mention here is that elections are fought by national political parties, but once elected, most MEPs opt to join a transnational group. We call it a political family, and almost always don't vote on national lines, they vote on party lines. Their most crucial first decision will be to choose a new European Commission president. This requires qualified majority voting, that is weighted majority voting in the Council, and a majority in the European Parliament. Now, normally, some of you will have heard of this, we use the German term, Spitzenkandidaten. They have a candidate, they have nominated someone who, if their party were to emerge as the biggest group in the new European Parliament, would become the Commission president. Ursula von der Leyen, the current president, is the Spitzenkandidat for the European People's Party, the centre-right party, and they will almost certainly be the biggest party. However, we have learnt in the past, the treaties don't say, the treaties simply say governments must take account of the elections. They don't have to choose a president from that party. And indeed, Ursula von der Leyen came about because they rejected the Parliament's candidate, who was the leader of the EPP group, called Manfred Weber. We saw even Barroso, famously, we had to, you get the situation really where there is a whole haggling, a whole horse trading that goes on, and no one quite knows how it's going to come out. Now, why is that? It's because now, the predictions are that Ursula von der Leyen will be the next Commission president, but she may struggle to get a majority in the Parliament. She only had a majority of 9 last time, could be very tight this time. If she doesn't, all sorts of names are being mentioned. We've had mention of the European Parliament president, Roberta Metsola. She's from the smallest member state, has no executive experience, so that seems unlikely. Mario Draghi, very popular in Brussels, particularly because of the role he played in the Euro and financial crisis as president of the European Central Bank. He's mentioned, but has no political affiliation. But a name could pop up that none of us have ever heard of before, as they scramble around and try to find somebody who no one can object to. And that is, I mentioned Jose Manuel Barroso before, when the UK vetoed Guy Verhofstadt, the Belgian Prime Minister, for being too federalist back in 2004, they cast around, and we journalists at the time were left scrabbling and Googling to say, who is he? It also then affects how the other top jobs are allocated. President of the Council, the group of when EU leaders meet and the High Representative for Foreign Policy, because you're trying to get a trade-off. You're trying to get a mix of big, small member state, left, right, north, south, east, west. A lot of feeling that one of the top jobs should go to an Eastern European this time, and so on. So it's immensely complicated. We will eventually come out with a name for Commission President. Then each country will nominate their commissioners, and then the Parliament will have hearings. Now, they can approve, they have the power to approve or reject the President. They don't have the power to approve or reject individual commissioners, but they can say they won't vote for the Commission as a whole if they don't like either the people who are nominated or the portfolios they're given. So lots of fun and games to come in Brussels. Well, we think it's fun and games between the elections and probably Christmas. It may be December before we know the full makeup of the Commission. Last two words on the implications for EU-UK relations. It's very hard to read this, and frankly, this year, the elections that I think matter for EU-UK relations are the UK elections themselves, assuming they happen this year. Broadly speaking, most member states and European politicians want closer relations with the EU and believe a Labour government would have more room for manoeuvre to make progress, but not at any price. Paradoxically, it could be that if we have more Eurosceptics, they might be more willing to help the UK to try and signal you can be out of the EU and get some benefits without being a member. But there's a very strong sense now, no one's arguing for, I don't know, an Irexit, a Grexit, a Frexit, all these other countries, because they've seen what's happened to the UK. And frankly, I think the most overriding sentiment here is people are very tired of the Brexit debate and they're adamantly opposed to any cherry picking. So they'll be watching the UK and then we'll see what this Parliament might mean for that. But that in a nutshell, a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that, Jackie. Our chair, Richard Morris, is having the infamous technical difficulties that we all love. So in terms of questions, Jackie, we're going to take those in the Q&A session from 10 past 7. Everyone, keep your questions coming into the chat. We've got some coming in already. Keep them coming. We're going to be moving swiftly on to Garvin now that Jackie's set up the lay of the land. Thank you very much for that, Jackie. Garvin, we'd like to invite you to have the floor and to speak on the potential threats of the far right and such in these elections. Thank you, Garvin.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and it's great to be dialing into the UK from here in Brussels. I'm going to look a bit at the far right, but also I want to talk a bit about the overall game of musical chairs that happens at just after the European elections and how the elections might affect that, and do a little bit on what this might mean because of the war and foreign policy as well. So let's start with those musical chairs. As Jackie so pointed out, it's not just the European Parliament that's elected. The European Parliament is involved in choosing the next Commission, and the next Commission President. And then, of course, the presidency of the European Council is also going to be up for grabs. Usually these things are done as a kind of job lot. You try and different political groups arrange different deals to see who can get which position. So if one of the big groups, say the centre-right EPP, ends up with the Commission President, usually it means that the centre-left S&D group, the Social Democrats, get something like the High Representative for Foreign Policy. And then there's also the question of who gets to chair the council. That isn't like the old presidency. It's much weaker than it used to be. It's sort of a role chairing the meetings, but it has a relatively high profile and usually favors some kind of consensus seeker from a smaller country, like the current incumbent, former Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel. What's going to happen this time? It's almost certain that Ursula von der Leyen is at least going to be proposed as a Commission President candidate. She is the Spitzenkandidat, the lead candidate for the EPP, and the EPP are going to be the biggest party. Whether she'll have a parliamentary majority is another question, because she's appearing a little bit weaker than she was a few months ago, when it looked like she was pretty inevitable. But she's had a couple of stumbles over Pfizer, over trying to appoint an EPP person to a small business agency role, and she has a number of opponents from the last time, particularly in the S&D group, who resent the way she was brought in at the last minute to prevent their guy, Franz Timmermans, from becoming the Commission president after Manfred Weber, the Parliament's initial choice, had been rejected by the heads of government and the Council. See, totally simple here in the EU. So it might well be you'll have an EPP centre-right Commission president, and then traditionally then the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission would go to the centre-left S&D group, and the Council is anyone's guess, though Draghi is certainly in the running for that. This is Mario Draghi, the former Italian Prime Minister. So with that musical chairs out, what's this thing about the far right? Well, think back 5 years ago to the last parliamentary elections in 2019. Then there were two big issues, and they were kind of dueling. There was the post-Brexit, post-Trump kind of wave of Euroscepticism and tough lines on migration, and that ended up fighting a bit of a duel with climate activism. This was just around the time when there were the big protests by Fridays for the Future, led by Greta Thunberg. So we saw a surge of young voters, a surge of Green voters, that meant that the Green group hugely increased its seats last time in 2019. It meant that the Renew group, the centrist Liberals, also did surprisingly well, and the hard right didn't do nearly as well as it looked like they would. This time the agenda is a bit different. There's a bit more of a backlash to green measures, as we saw with things to do with the farmers' protests, which you've had in the UK as well, but also measures to conserve nature that farmers are also pretty worried about. On the other side, the far right, although numerically doing quite well in certain countries like France, is also in a bit of a dilemma because of the war. A lot of the far right parties are indirectly or even directly supported by the Kremlin, but others are very much hostile to Russia. For example, Poland's Law and Justice Party is extremely anti-Russian, as you would expect a right-wing nationalist Polish party to be. So I think the predictions that there will be a far-right surge or far-right takeover are, in the end, I think, pretty overdone. They look at certain things happening in Germany and perhaps France, and they try and extrapolate that across the entirety of the EU, and you can't really do that anymore. It might have been possible in the 1970s and 1980s, when really these were the two dominant forces and the two biggest countries in the EU, apart from, of course, from the UK, but now, and Italy. But now we have an EU of 27 member states, 450 million people across the entire continent, and things are looking a bit different. I'm going to go through these countries now in a little bit of detail. Obviously, we look at France. The far right Rassemblement National are doing extremely well. They will probably top the poll and have the largest number of MEPs from France. The AfD in Germany were doing reasonably well. They were coming second in some opinion polls, but now they've been taken down a peg or two by the emergence of another party that describes itself as socially conservative and economically left-wing, led by the former leader of the German post-communist party, Sarah Wagenknecht. And her party is taking some votes away from the AfD, so it doesn't look like they're going to do as well as they initially had thought. Italy is also a curious case. Giorgia Meloni from the conservative or hard right, we can debate where exactly we put her, Fratelli d'Italia party. She did very well in the general election, and looks like she's going to do extremely well in the European elections. However, the underlying effect of that is just for her to take votes that used to belong to the populist right-wing Lega. This is the old Northern League party. This is so if you look at the overall Italian results, what you actually see is a small swing towards a centrist liberal Renew group in Italy of about 6 or 7 seats. Where else does that leave us? In Spain, it's the center right that are doing very well. The EPPs, Partido Popular, they weren't able to form a government because people were scared that they might end up going into government with the hard right Vox party. Vox didn't do so well; they couldn't form a majority together, so you end up with the centre left in power in Spain. But the Partido Popular will probably do pretty well in the European elections. Then we have and we have Poland. In Poland, you have the opposite phenomenon: the Law and Justice, who were the nationalist populist party. They've been ejected in parliamentary elections last year. It's the centrist, center-right, centrist coalition that dominates Polish politics now. They'll have a major majority of the seats. And this means the hard right groups will have fewer. So why then has there been this story that there's been the potential for a sort of far right, hard right, right wing swing in the EU? It's partly a mobilizing device that the left is trying to do to get people out of their polls and vote for them. That happens in politics. But if you look in more detail, it's very hard to see how this theoretical right wing majority could come into being, even if you add in all the hard right and center right parties. You could end up just about with a majority, even if that was possible, and it may not be enough. There's no way those parties are going to work together. They're fundamentally divided on a whole host of issues, from the continuation of liberal democracy at its most fundamental to disagreements over attitudes to Russia. You have very pro-Russian parties, and then you have very anti-Russian parties. And then you just have national disagreements that make it impossible to imagine this kind of coalition. There is no way that the civic platform in Poland is going to go into an alliance with the Law and Justice in Poland as part of a single group. It's simply not going to occur, and we're much more likely to get a situation where the EPP, the centre right, are going to be the biggest party. They're going to have a little bit more difficulty arranging a coalition, but they're going to be able to count on support from the Liberal Centre for quite a lot of the legislation, from the S&D for some of it, perhaps even from the Greens. If we look to the right of the European People's Party, there are basically two groups. There's the European Conservative and Reformists, and then there's the Identity and Democracy group. As the name suggests, the Identity and Democracy group is very much the extreme right, borderline fascist type of grouping. Then you have the ECR, who are hardline conservatives, quite Eurosceptic, but they often end up separating themselves from ID. There are significant disagreements within those parties, both on strategy and also on actual policies, whether that's to do with Russia, whether it's to do with attitudes to international trade. There's an awful lot they don't agree on. They don't even necessarily agree on migration policy. One of the reasons the two groups never got together in the last parliament was because the Italian nationalists wanted refugees to go to the rest of Europe because they were a border country receiving a lot of them, whereas Polish and Hungarian nationalists wanted them to stay away. This kind of dynamic means that we're likely to end up with something pretty much similar to what we've got now: a centrist-dominated parliament, maybe a little bit slightly more to the right, slightly fewer environmentalists than there were last time, but pretty much, I'm afraid to say, for people who like to write headlines, pretty much steady as it goes after these elections this June. I see my time is running up, so I just want to add one last moment. We saw one thing 2 weeks ago in the European Parliament finally flexing its muscles and acting like something with control of the purse strings. They refused to approve an aspect of the Council's budget until the Council agreed to send Patriot missiles to Ukraine. So this is the Parliament acting outside its formal powers for once, and instead using the power of the purse in the same way that traditional parliaments have done whenever there's been a disagreement between the Parliament and executive. Is that something we're going to see more of in the next session? Perhaps we might. Perhaps they finally discover their muscles. Now, let's see. And if any of you do have European passports who are watching this, make sure you go out and vote this June. Thank you, and thank you very much. to everyone else.
Garvin, thank you very much indeed. And my apologies, my technology at my end completely packed up just the moment that the webinar began, but it's lovely to be back again. And Garvin, I only heard, I'm afraid, the second half of what you said, but it sounded to me rather more reassuring than I had expected, but we'll come back to that anyway. Maybe now just go on to our third speaker, Dr. Stephanie Luke. Just to tell you a little bit about her background, she's a research associate based in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. She's also a seminar and lecture tutor at Durham University, teaching modules on European politics and democratic political systems. Stephanie completed her PhD in comparative politics at the University of York, and she's currently working on a wide variety of projects, including a European Commission funded project on data-driven election campaigns, and also a project about reporting the next general election to facilitate the use of more academic research in election coverage. But her research also takes her much more widely across European politics, Euroscepticism, far-right parties, and party politics. And Stephanie will speak to us, particularly on the green divide. In other words, how the electoral circumstances and far-right stances and divisions, and some of the things Garvin has been talking about, in the more centrist parties, mean that the green agenda may well be the most divisive election issue, with the EU's global leadership on climate change potentially under threat. She may also want to talk a bit more widely, to you, Stephanie, about the far-right threat, as I know you have done so much extensive research on that. So over to you, please.
No, thank you very much. And unfortunately, I might be putting a damper on what Garvin said about the far right. But you know, there's always hope. So thank you very much for having me. So I'll be looking generally at the EU's Green Deal, as well as far right parties and the role they have to play within this. So as with previous EU elections, the far right remain an ever-present threat. The far right are split across these two European parliamentary groups. So you've got Identity and Democracy and the European Conservatives and Reformist group. So with the latter group, they have been known to be called like hard conservatives. They have got far right parties in them. So this group is a bit more problematic to identify with, because they do have different political parties within them. They're not all classed as far right parties. So despite the fact they are not united under one banner, they are both predicted to do well. So the ID group is predicted to become the third largest group and the ECR the fourth. So whilst there are several difficulties that the far right would have to overcome to unite as one group, so I think we've mentioned before about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is disagreements over that, and whether Viktor Orban's party will be allowed to join the ECR, and this is if they actually want to join it. There is plenty that both groups have in common, and they have shown that they are able to create issue-based alliances, so they don't need to be united in one group. So whilst issues like immigration, a core part of the far right's agenda, has not gone away, the far right has picked up on farmers' grievances as part of a wider drive against EU influence. So again, this is the opposition to the EU's Green Deal is very much in the scheme of their opposition to the EU and aspects of it. So this week's plenary in the European Parliament has seen ECR MEPs speak against the Green Deal. So you had an MEP from the Law and Justice Party in Poland saying that with the Green Deal, you want to save the world using the pockets of Europeans. So fundamentally, the Green Deal is being linked to the economy and the fact that European populations are suffering. ID have also reiterated similar statements, and both have incorporated opposition of the EU's Green Deal into their rhetoric and about how much like the EU has too much power, basically. So in light of the far right's general attitude towards climate change, either disagreeing with it or outright rejecting the science of human-made climate change, we shouldn't be really too surprised that the far right oppose the EU's Green Deal. However, there are a particular set of circumstances that the predicted results of the European elections could create. So firstly, the Greens are predicted to lose quite a few seats, And so there's a lot of studies that have shown that the presence of Green parties, whether it's in coalition or just present in the electoral system in general, help to push the Green agenda forward. So without a vocal support of the EU's Green Deal, it and green policies more broadly risk being removed from the agenda. Secondly, the predicted increase in support for both ID and ECR potentially increases their influence to the future of the EU's Green Deal. So far we've seen like the ECR and ID join forces. So they've watered down the nature restoration law recently. If both groups do as well as predicted, they will not need to be in one group to have influence. And I think this is the important thing, that they don't actually need to be united. And given their opposition to the EU Green Deal, it is likely that they will be able to cooperate, at least on this area, even if they disagree fundamentally in others. In addition, the far right seemingly recognise the battle they face when other EP groups do not want to work with them. So in efforts to gain more power and influence, the emphasis that they do seem to be on now is working with Parliament in a constructive way. Again, what does constructive mean? Who knows? But the fact is that they are trying to work with these and make themselves appear more sort of acceptable in a way. So not only is it important to see the extent to which they gain more seats in the European Parliament, it's also about whether other parties will be willing to work with them. So also with the fact that the centre-right European People's Party are expected to make gains, the right-wing forces could reach a majority, and this is potentially anyway, reach a majority for the first time in the European Parliament's history. Given the EPP's less than supportive attitude towards the Green Deal of late, it doesn't really look too promising for the EU Green Deal's future. And also, I think Jackie mentioned about national elections. So they are taking place, quite a lot of them in the same year, or even on the same day as the European elections. So with Belgium has this on the same day. And if we still think that national elections take preference over EU elections, and I'm using that term loosely, and national interest will be of particular importance. So it's like thus an apparent attempt to counteract the electoral threat posed by far-right parties, particularly in national elections as well as the European parliamentary elections. Parties of the centre are rolling back on their previous commitments to the EU Green Deal. But we know that appealing to far-right policies does not attract far-right voters. Instead, all it does is normalise their policies and encourage people to vote for the original party. So in this case, it would be the far-right. And even more significantly is the fact that the opposition to the Green Deal is not solely coming from the far-right. So in 2019, when the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen unveiled the EU Green Deal, she described it as Europe's man on the moon moment. Since then, and particularly in the run-up to the elections, her EPP group has supported the watering down of several proposed laws, including the nature restoration law, and scrapped new rules on pesticides. In doing so, the EPP has cooperated with both of the ID and ECR groups and has emphasised the burdens on farmers. So the willingness of the EPP to cooperate with these two groups will also potentially decide the future of the EU's Green Deal. So at present, the EPP has said that they would work with anyone who is pro-Ukraine, pro-European and pro-rule of law. However, developments within the ECR, so for instance, whether Orban will join, and the refusal of the EPP to work with Alternative for Germany, who's in the ID group, and Marine Le Pen's party, the National Rally, who's also in the ID group, might scupper any potential cooperation. Although, if previous experience is anything to go by, they may inadvertently end up cooperating with both groups, even on a very informal basis. So looking beyond the centre-right, the centre-left Socialists and Democrats group are not as openly supportive as they once were of the EU's Green Deal. Their commitment to climate action has been questioned, in particular by the Greens, with the SND's lead candidate arguing that we need to have a climate policy that is also socially balanced because we have to take the people with us. And such an approach by centrist parties seems somewhat misguided, considering a large majority of Europeans support ambitious action to fight climate change. Admittedly, though, a majority is also worried about the costs involved, and the latter is what the centrist and far-right parties seem to be stressing. While the Greens appear to be the only ones strongly supporting the EU's Green Deal, even they have admitted that the Greens' EU campaign strategy is about repackaging existing climate-friendly proposals and tailoring them to a current context marked by a cost of living crisis. So again, you can see this link between climate action and the economy. These new laws come at a time when the EU faces an economic crisis, with growth down and the EU populations are struggling. So if ever it was a bad time to put forward new changes to tackle climate change, then it is now. But when would be the right time is the question. So the EU's Green Deal is also not just a recent divisive issue. Over the past 5 years, there have been a wide divergence between both the centre-left S&D group and the centre-right EPP as to whether they have supported or rejected the more ambitious climate action and targets. And actually, the EPP hasn't been keen to support a lot of ambitious policies. It's been the S&D group that have supported them more. And in the last Parliament debate yesterday, the future of the EU's Green Deal was discussed. While the Greens wanted to make these elections the Green Deal elections, they also attacked the right for extensive attacks on the deal. The EPP argued that they stand behind the Green Deal, but its actions to withdraw or weaken aspects of the Green Deal seem to contradict that. Interestingly, all parties seemingly were attacking each other over the lack of support for the Green Deal. And this is the thing, they are all attacking each other for the degrees to which they support it. And this is why it's potentially going to be a divisive issue, not just because of the far right mention it, but the fact that all the sort of centrist parties are attacking each other for their lack of support. However, maybe on a more positive note, while the main political groups vary in the prominence that they give to the Green Deal or climate change or the environment within their manifestos, the one thing they have in common is that they agree that some sort of climate action is necessary. So while the Green Deal may be at risk of being either further watered down or removed from the agenda, climate action will not be wiped from the agenda completely. So yeah, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Stephanie, thank you very much for that, even though there's a lot of, I'm sure you'll be recognizing that there's a lot of potential anxiety in many of the things that you've said, but quite rightly to be fully warned and aware. I think as time is a bit short, I was going to suggest that panel members had a discussion between themselves about the matters which have arisen. But I think perhaps as time is short, we should get on to the questions from the audience. And so if all panel members could come back on screen and the first question could be put, it'll still leave plenty of time for panel members to discuss things amongst themselves in the context, I think, of those questions. So here we are. And I think the first question comes from David Dundas. Do any of the EU members have plans to send illegal immigrants to third world countries such as Rwanda? I don't know who would like to answer that. Would Garvin, would you like to have a shot at that one first?
Yeah. So there are two relevant parts of this that two EU countries are pursuing. So Italy has arranged a deal with Albania to put people who have been found in the Adriatic Sea by Italian Coast Guard and Navy to put them in Albania and to be processed there. Now, Albania is not a third world country, but and ironically, it is also the country from which a lot of the people arriving in the UK on small boats do come here. Then that's actually mostly because Albanians have the ability to work or the ability to travel, let's say, across the Schengen zone for about 90 days. So they do a lot of informal working in Europe, but getting into the UK is more difficult, which is why they end up having to come through this more circuitous route. And the other country that's exploring this is Denmark. Denmark has a center-left government, but it's one that's taken an extremely tough line on immigration. And they're also trying to see if there's somewhere that people could be sent to. But Macron set himself out against it today in his Sorbonne speech. Many other countries don't want to go anywhere near this kind of thing, and it would be very difficult to get this policy through both the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights.
But just if I could add, Richard, the European People's Party, the centre-right grouping, Ursula von der Leyen's group, are saying that they will put this is something they are campaigning on, the idea that the EU could do deals with a series of countries in this area. And I think it's an interesting instance of what Stephanie was talking about when you borrow clothes. You were talking about it, Stephanie, in the context of the Green Deal, but also on migration. We are seeing one of the impacts of the successes of the far right in some key countries, driving the agenda of the centre-right further to the right on this issue. I think migration is going to play hugely, and the EPP seem to be indicating they're going to make big play of this. Whether it'll come to anything after the elections, because these things have to be agreed among the member states if they are to be EU deals, is another question.
Thank you, Jackie. Stephanie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I just further the fact that immigration is still going to be an ever-present issue within the elections, and especially because the far right are predicted to do so well, and centrist parties feel the need to adapt their stance towards them, and I think this is the big problem. I just reaffirm what everybody else has said.
Thank you. Let's go on to the next question then. This is from Irene Wyndham Sweeney. Is there still a chance that UK's under 30s could get special permission to spend extended study work time in EU countries? The idea seems to have been voted down too swiftly, of course, both by the government and the opposition. I wonder if, Jackie, you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I think the timing of this, frankly, I think this was a huge political misstep by the Commission. They said they were doing it now and making this offer. It would be reciprocal, by the way. The EU is not offering, you can all come to us. It has to be a two-way deal that European students can go to the UK. So no, they won't get special permission unless unless it works both ways round. But I think the sense was the Commission said part of the reason for doing it now was that some member states were talking to the UK bilaterally about this issue, and they wanted to avoid any risk of people doing separate deals. The EU, when it deals with Brexit related issues, always wants to act as one, and it's one of the reasons they've been very effective in negotiations. So I think the political reaction in the UK was the only reaction there could have been. And the Labour Party are trying to keep this off the agenda for the election, and therefore, given the timing, they rejected it. I think had this been put after an election, if the British opinion polls are to be believed, you would have seen a much warmer response and a let's talk. So could it come back? I mean, at the moment it's been ruled out. They've narrowed the Labour government party's room for manoeuvre post-election. So I think it was very unfortunate, because I think it would have stood a really good chance of getting through had the timing been better. So for me, a huge political misstep by the Commission.
Yes, I suppose it's a matter of timing is what was at fault. I must say, I mean, it does seem as if the UK's response is quite a snub to the EU, but maybe that was inevitable following such bad timing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it would. There were a lot of people in Brussels who said the same themselves. So they're not saying, "Oh, this is the UK saying, two fingers up to you." They're saying, "No, we recognise the politics of this right now, and this wasn't clever."
Yeah. Does the other of you wish to comment on that one?
I just think, I think they don't want to rehash any Brexit divides that has previously come up, and I think, like if they'd said, I think Labour, they generally just don't want to approach the topic whatsoever, so it's best to avoid it rather than actually acknowledging it. And there's always hope that it comes back after the election. I think, once they're in power, it might be that they start distinguishing themselves from what a Conservative Party would do. But I think, we'll wait and see.
Right, thank you. Garvin?
No, nothing more to add, really, here.
Nothing to add, fine. Can we go on?
Let's go back to the...
Then, please. Yeah. So from Richard Wilson, who is one of the vice chairs of the European Movement UK, he asks, is there any danger of anti-EU parties winning significant gains in these elections, similar to how UKIP used to do when we were members of the EU? Yes, Garvin, as you're on, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. I think, I mean, if you're looking at France, the National Rally is going to do very well. Now, they're less anti-European than they used to say they were, or they're saying they're less anti-European than they used to say they were. They're no longer talking about Frexit, and they're not talking about France leaving the euro, but they're talking about, more French sovereignty, less European coordination, and obviously less European expansion into areas of security and defense. The interesting one here is Italy, because here you had a populist Eurosceptic party is being replaced by another right-wing party that's trying to do something a bit different. Whereas the others parties like Salvini's Lega or even the French National Rally would think that the EU was just sort of incorrigibly federalist and centrist and left-wing, and they didn't like it. Meloni, I think, seems to have a pan-European hard right agenda. So she'd like to see a Europe that is systematically anti-immigration, probably weaker on the rule of law, probably stronger on defense. And she wants to take these less likely to take action on climate. And she wants to take these right-wing issues and Europeanize them and put herself at the head of that kind of movement. So they're, just because they may be less anti-EU doesn't mean they're going to be less hard right. There's a change happening, and Meloni's hoping to put herself at the head of that change.
Thank you. Jackie?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about populist parties across Europe is their main argument is to be against. So they are anti-EU, they are anti the establishment. You see a lot of the similar language to what you see from Donald Trump in the United States. There are some parallels there. And I do think, I mean, while, as we've said, no one is talking, no other country now is talking about leaving the EU, because the UK has done the rest of Europe a great favour. Tragically for our country, by showing what a bad idea it is. And so you now don't see countries arguing for leaving. But as I said in my opening remarks, I do think there's going to be a problem when it comes to talking about the future of the European Union. There is a huge debate beginning in Europe now about what the EU needs to do to reform itself, to be able to take decisions, to be able to function effectively, if it grows to more than 30 members, when we see Ukraine, countries from the Balkans and so on joining. And there's a lot of a sense that in the face of the challenges that we're up against, geopolitical, but also internal to the EU, then there do need to be, we need a more effective way of taking decisions. And the real concern, and where I think they could have a huge impact in the next parliament, is on that debate, on making it even more difficult. EU governments find it very hard to agree on anything, particularly if it might look like it needs treaty reform and therefore referenda. They find it very hard to discuss these issues and to come to a deal. And if you have a significant anti-EU, disruptive, fragmented European Parliament, I think that could play very significantly into that discussion. And I think that's where, Garvin was saying earlier, it's more steady as it goes. I think in terms of day-to-day business, there may not be as much disruption as people fear. But when it comes to the big questions the European Union is facing, there is real concern that these parties, anti-EU and anti-everything, can be really disruptive and make it impossible to make progress. And some people say if the EU can't reform itself, then enlargement is doomed. And you heard Macron today say, we need to make choices. The EU, Europe could die, he said. Now, he put it in fairly apocalyptic terms. But what he really meant was there's been a lot of talk in Europe since Russia invaded Ukraine about what the Germans call the Zeitenwende, the turning point for Europe. But a sense that while everybody said it was a turning point, they're not doing any of the things that you need to respond to that turning point. And Macron, in rather dramatic terms, as is his wont, was spelling out why he thinks those choices have to be faced now. They could be all the more difficult if predictions for the outcome of this election and this more disrupted, fragmented parliament are realised.
Yes, that's very concerning. Thank you,
I just
Jackie,
want
very
to
much.
can I just come back very quickly
Yes, of course. Yeah.
on that one, which is that it's all very well to blame the far right for this, but in a sense you're scapegoating them because it's the centrist leaders of Europe that aren't getting their act together here. Even Macron today gave this nice ambitious speech. He came on to his defense policy, and his defense policy was basically buy French. He's not doing the creative thinking we need, nor are the Dutch, who are saying we've got to do stuff, but we're not going to pay for it. The Germans aren't either. People seem to say they want a reforming EU that works as long as they don't have to do any reforms in order to make it work. And this is down to the mainstream leaders of European political parties. They need to start leading their debate, and they're not. And unless they do, there will be an enormous crunch around 2030, 2031, when Ukraine probably starts meeting the accession criteria, and we have to face the question of whether they should be let in or not. Are we able to reform ourselves to let these other countries in, to have 30 members? Could we have 5 or 6 Orbans gumming up the works? Or are we able to have more streamlined decision-making procedures? At the moment, the centrist mainstream leaders of Europe aren't preparing their publics for that kind of debate at all. Far right or no far right.
Sorry. Can I just add something?
Yes, of course, yes.
No, I was gonna. So I think appearances can be deceptive with the far right, and whilst yes, you can blame the centrist parties, and they are to blame to some extent. I think the far right have got this knack now of they're very subtle in what they say, and like Maloney, very much anti-EU coming into it now. She's suddenly become pro-EU, whatever that means. And I think that's the problem. What does pro-EU actually mean? And in these parties, it's sort of they're working with the system, but they actually want to reform it. And I mean, even Macron's speech, he was saying basically that he mentioned the nationalists that no longer argue in favour of leaving the EU, but simply of disrupting it from the inside. And I think that's the point. Centrist parties struggle to deal with this. So I think it's easy to blame somewhat the centrist parties for not responding in the right way, but I think equally the far right have such an ability now to sort of present themselves as being something that they're not fundamentally, and I think this is the dynamic that they're trying to work with.
Michael, I think we've got a couple more questions. Is that right? From David.
Dream on.
If the UK decide to rejoin the EU, will we be able to be on the same terms as we had as members?
Not a hope.
Nope.
Nope.
I think that's a pretty quick answer to that one.
We'd have to be, I mean, this is the irony about the UK. They never realised how lucky they were and how good they had it in terms of the number of opt-outs we had, exceptions from rules, etc. If we wanted back in, it would be all or nothing. And I think that's part of the problem here. And when you talk about, okay, how do we move closer together? Even if we don't decide to rejoin, if we want to move closer, if we decided we wanted to be in a customs union or the single market, this idea that we could cherry pick in any way, the UK was so used to being an exception, to getting special deals from the euro to everything else. It's not going to happen again. It'll be all in or all out.
And I think it'll be an awfully long time before all in can even be considered when confidence once shaken takes a long time to restore. Let's move on to the next question, I think, then. From John Fisher, what about the idea of a European army? Is that still on the agenda? Who'd like to talk to that one? Garvin, would that be for you, do you think?
Yeah. European army as such isn't on the agenda. The national armies have all the command structures. NATO has the coordinating headquarters, the logistics, and as long as Trump doesn't get elected, the support of the United States, which is vital both for supply and actually carrying out the defense of Europe. But there is a big talk about having European coordinated defense procurement, integration of the defense industries, increasing production, training exercises together, and getting closer to an integrated defense policy, which is provided for by the treaty. There will probably be significant steps towards increasing that kind of coordination, or at least many member states increasing their kind of coordination. So we mightn't see Hungary take part in this, we mightn't see Slovakia or Austria take part in this, but or Ireland or Malta, but many countries will be quite keen to pool their defense efforts. Quite keen to, a lot of states in both the Nordics and in Eastern Europe are increasing their defense spending significantly. There are attempts to revitalize the European defense industry. There will be a new kind of defense industry commissioner in the next commission. It's unclear exactly how far that will go, but there's going to be significantly more attention put on these aspects of European defense. We may even see significant increases in personnel in a number of countries. Poland's going to increase its defense budget to about 4.5% of GDP. The Nordic countries are reintroducing conscription. Obviously, the Baltic states are very agitated, though they are very small. So you're seeing a reinvigorated European defense world. And the question then is what the role will be for the UK in that as well. The UK is still a major military power, still one of the largest European air powers, but it's not clear that we're going to be able to work out exactly how the UK and the UK defence industry can become involved in this burgeoning, not just EU, but burgeoning European project of rearmament and increased emphasis on security policy. The UK wants things like being in the political security committee of the EU without being members of the EU. That's not going to happen. But the UK does have a legitimate say in saying that, hold on a minute, we're one of the biggest military powers on the continent. We have a very advanced defense industry, and we'd quite like to be in the room if we're going to make such a big contribution. So finding some other way to allow that cooperation to take place is going to be one of the main tasks for the next 5 years.
So it sounds rather like a sort of coalition of the willing, with not everybody coming on board, and big questions about how the UK comes on board. Jackie or Stephanie, would you like to comment on that?
Just very briefly on this. I mean, I think this is one of the key areas where, when the Brexit vote first happened, there was a real hope in Europe that the UK on this, they wanted the UK on board. They wanted to find mechanisms to be able to work together. And initially the reaction was very much, no, we're gone. I think Gavin is right in the sense that now, yes, everybody sees the benefit of working more closely together on this. We saw Rishi Sunak going to Poland and going to Berlin this week and talking about we're going to spend more on defence, bit lecturing other EU countries on how much they should be spending. I think the Brits really need to be careful about lecturing the rest of Europe from outside. But this is an area where everyone believes we need to work together more. I'm talking UK, EU now, but how you do it, as Garvin was indicating, immensely complicated, because it has to be on a basis that really works for everyone. So I think, this is probably, if we see a Labour government, I would expect this to be one of the first areas where they would look to see whether we can cooperate more closely. But it is always, the devil is always in the detail of how you do these sorts of things. But I think it is going to be a key area, particularly in light of where we find ourselves now.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, that the issue of the European army has never really gone away. It's always been sort of, present in some shape or form. I think the longest standing issue is that, member states are reluctant to have their own national forces be clumped into a European army, and I think that is what's the stumbling block. So I think they like to cooperate on defence, but maybe it's not necessarily in terms of this aspect of it. And like you say, as Austria, being a neutral country, they're not going to be partaking in the European army. So I think it's maybe not going to be something that will be pushed forward, but it will be still a thing that will be talked about.
Thank you. Well, I think that brings us to an end to the questions, and we are just a little bit after 7:30. So I think we probably should terminate things there, unless any of the three panelists would like to have a final word on anything that has been said.
Just to say, I'm so thrilled to have my vote back in the UK. So thrilled. I have registered. I am back. I will be voting for the first time. I left Britain over 30 years ago, didn't get a vote in the referendum, which I thought was scandalous. And I'm very excited that I'll be able to vote here in Belgium, as a Belgian as I am now, in these national elections, and then in the UK later. That was just a personal, I just wish I'd had it for the referendum, but there we go.
Jackie, I'm very happy for you. That's wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I mean, I think that it covered an awful lot of ground, that talk. I think, to my mind, the points made about enlargement and integration, these extraordinary huge forces which the EU is going to have to face over the coming 10 or 15 years, and quite how it deals with them, and the implications of any change in the shape of the makeup of the European Parliament and of the Commission does seem to me to be something enormous that is going to have to be faced over this coming period. But thank you all very much for those wonderful contributions. I'd just like also to record thanks to Mark English, our expert in Brussels for the EM UK, who put together this splendid panel, to Michael Anderson for the coordination of the arrangements, and to Scott Daniels for all the technology.